Seizing the center immediately opens crucial diagonals and prepares for rapid piece development. Mirroring the central pawn establishes immediate equilibrium and opens lines for piece development, preparing for a balanced middle-game struggle. Establishing central influence and preparing rapid development, knight takes aim at the e5 pawn's defense. Solidifying the central pawn and developing a piece, this reply embraces symmetry, setting the stage for a balanced, tactical skirmish. Introducing the Ruy-Lopez, a strategic gambit that immediately pins Black's knight and sets the stage for a fierce positional struggle, challenging Black's central pawn. Challenging the bishop's influence immediately, this pawn advance probes White's intentions and prepares to gain tempo should the bishop retreat. Maintaining the pin's pressure, White subtly preserves pawn structure while preparing future central action. Challenging White's central pawn and opening lines for action, this development also prepares castling while subtly influencing the queenside. Safeguarding the king unlocks queenside pressure and prepares rapid development. Boldly snatching that central pawn ignores development's vital flow, inviting potential tactical chaos. Opening the center with d4 immediately challenges Black's aggressive knight on e4, aiming to disrupt their pawn structure and gain space. This move forces a decision: defend the knight or continue the attack, potentially leading to complex tactical sequences where pieces could be exchanged or White could seize a central advantage. Boldly challenging the bishop's retreat, Black forces a decision and grabs central space, though it does open up queenside weaknesses. Repositioning the bishop to b3 offers a crucial defensive shield for the king while simultaneously preparing to contest the central dark squares should Black opt for b7 and d6. Instantly claiming central space with the pawn solidifies Black's presence, creating a dynamic pawn chain that could prove difficult to dislodge and potentially opens avenues for active piece play later. Liberating the d-file allows a potent counterplay against Black's center, aiming to disrupt their pawn structure and open lines for White's pieces. This advance creates immediate tension, forcing Black to address the threat of a pawn fork on c6 and potentially creating weaknesses if they defend passively. It's a bold statement, asserting initiative and challenging Black to find a precise response. Finally addressing the central tension, this maneuver prepares to reclaim the pawn while simultaneously activating the bishop, aiming to disrupt White's comfortable pawn chain and open diagonals for counterplay. Reinforcing the e4 pawn with this defensive maneuver simultaneously prepares to expand central influence, potentially creating a strong pawn chain that aims to restrict Black's development and create attacking opportunities on the kingside. Developing the bishop to its natural square, it actively influences the center and prepares for castling, reinforcing the pawn structure while anticipating a potential kingside maneuver. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal aims to both support the central pawn structure and potentially prepare for aggressive kingside operations later, while also keeping a watchful eye on the d6 square. A bold assertion of central influence, this knight's advance aims to disrupt White's pawn structure and open lines for counterplay while also preparing to contest the d4 square. The knight's journey to d4 is a bold repositioning, aiming to create immediate threats and exploit Black's slightly loose pawn structure. It cleverly avoids engaging directly with Black's active pieces while simultaneously preparing to assert influence over the central squares, particularly e6. Observe how this knight, no longer pinned or passively defending, now eyes potential entry points and can readily shift to f5 or b5 if the opportunity arises, forcing Black to constantly recalculate defensive measures and potentially weaken their own position in the process of addressing these new dangers. Eliminating the knight that was actively pressuring your e-pawn not only simplifies the position, but also opens up potential diagonal attacks against the white king as the center pieces begin to clear. Asserting central control with the pawn establishes a strong foothold, creating an inviting outpost for the knight on d4 and restricting Black's light-squared bishop's future mobility, forcing it to a less active square. Black challenges the central pawn structure and aims to disrupt White's knight positioning by capturing the knight on b3. This exchange, while seemingly a simple pawn grab has broader implications for piece activity and pawn control. By removing white's advanced knight, black hopes to alleviate some of the pressure on their kingside and potentially open up lines for their own pieces. However, it also opens the d-file for white and creates a passed pawn if white recaptures with the pawn. The strategic goal here is to simplify the position and perhaps reach a more comfortable middle game where black's pieces can be more actively placed. Pouncing on the unprotected pawn, the queen now surveys the weakened queenside structure, a testament to black's recent pawn thrusts, aiming to exploit the lack of immediate defenders. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black initiates an ambitious, yet potentially risky frontal assault aimed at disrupting white's centralized queenside control and perhaps creating weaknesses around the enemy king before it's too late. Reclaiming the knight's post on d2 initiates a subtle repositioning, aiming to redeploy the piece to a more active square, perhaps f3 or even e4, to support the central pawn structure and potentially menace black's queenside. This maneuver acknowledges the loss of the bishop pair and focuses on consolidating white's position before black can fully exploit the open lines. The knight's journey back is not just a retreat but a strategic regrouping, preparing for future attacks or defensive stands. Unlocking the queenside by challenging white's central pawn structure, this maneuver creates immediate tension and aims to gain valuable space, forcing white to react rather than dictate further development and potentially disrupting their intended castling advantages. Asserting dominance over the central files, the rook's arrival on c1 immediately challenges black's isolated pawn on c5 and prepares for a potential queenside invasion, building pressure along the open column and tying down black's resources. Black challenges the pawn chain's structural integrity, aiming to disrupt white's central control and open lines for piece activity by forcing a pawn exchange. White retreats the queen, seeking safer pastures from the impending pawn storm on the kingside, and redeploying the piece to a more active central square where it can support potential central breaks or defend the king. The aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside aims to dismantle white's queenside pawn structure and open lines towards the monarch, a bold but potentially double-edged commitment that could leave the black king exposed if white's counterplay materializes effectively. Reclaiming the initiative on the king's side, white repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses and providing defensive support while also preparing to challenge the open c-file, a crucial pathway in this congested position. The rook's relocation to the c-file immediately intensifies pressure along that open avenue, directly challenging white's pawn structure and potentially preparing for a future advance that could compromise the e3 bishop's defense. Securing the queenside pawn structure while simultaneously creating potential for queenside expansion marks a pragmatic approach, aiming to restrict black's dynamic play initiated by g5. Seeking to gain space on the queenside, black pushes the pawn forward, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking possibilities on that flank. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, 19. b4 aims to disrupt black's advancing infantry and create counterplay, even if it does expose white's own king somewhat to the central threats black has been building. Unbalancing the pawn structure, black initiates a daring pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines towards the king. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to dismantle white's cohesive central pawn chain and create dynamic counterplay on the queenside, forcing white to confront immediate threats and potentially abandon their carefully built positional advantage. Unlocking the queenside initiative, this capture reopens lines and forces black to confront the implications of their pawn storm. By reclaiming the b4 square, white gains valuable territory, disrupting black's queenside plans and potentially preparing for pawn advancements or piece maneuvering into the newly opened avenues. This exchange fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating immediate tactical considerations and demanding careful assessment of the resultant imbalances for both sides. Pushing the g-pawn aggressively opens a dangerous diagonal towards white's king, creating significant tactical complications and demanding immediate attention from white's pieces. The rook's audacious hop to a7 immediately injects a dose of positional aggression, aiming to sever black's developing queenside pawn chain and disrupt the already precarious structure. This audacious maneuver not only threatens to pick off the undefended c4 pawn, but also opens up the possibility of a deep infiltration, potentially landing on the third or second rank to torment the black king and restrict the defender's pieces. It's a bold gambit that sacrifices immediate pawn capture for a dynamic initiative, forcing black into a defensive posture and testing their ability to coordinate their forces against this encroaching threat. The rook ventures aggressively to the seventh rank, a bold attempt to disrupt white's growing influence and potentially pry open the a-file, though it risks becoming somewhat isolated and a target for counterplay. Seizing the open file with the rook drastically increases pressure on black's queen side, threatening to penetrate and exploit the weakness created by the pawn advance. Securing the king after that, pawn storm advances on the king side, finally bringing the monarch to safety and preparing for potential counterplay as the rooks now eye the central files. The bishop's daring excursion to h6 immediately targets the seemingly secure castled king, creating immediate discomfort and forcing black to confront potential weaknesses on the king side. This aggressive maneuver is designed to disrupt black's developing harmony and exploit the advanced nature of white's pieces, particularly the rook battery on the file, by opening avenues for attack. Preparing to challenge the open file and potentially create a two-pronged attack against the overextended white queen, black's rook repositions to a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated piece play and liberate its own pieces from passive defense. Seeking to dislodge the entrenched black rook and consolidate queenside pressure, white aims to activate the queen and exploit potential weaknesses on the queen side, possibly eyeing a future advance or rerouting the queen for a more central role, while simultaneously probing black's defensive setup and preparing for potential tactical skirmishes. Black seeks to activate the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially target the now vulnerable dark squares around the white king. Clearing out the a-file, this capture on c7 finally addresses white's isolated queen's pawn and opens a direct route for the rook. A decisive moment where the queens duel for dominance, black's capture reopens the c-file and prepares to contest the semi-open file, potentially forcing further exchanges that might alleviate white's queenside pressure. Asserting dominance on the queen side, the knight's repositioning to b3 aims to disrupt black's expansive pawn chain and potentially eye the weak d5 square, forcing black to confront this new pressure before solidifying their own attacking structure. The bishop seeks safer pastures, abandoning the potentially exposed f-file, aiming to consolidate its influence from g6, a position offering both defensive solidity and future attacking potential by eyeing the king side. Clearing the back rank for better piece deployment, this maneuver prepares to activate the rook from the d-file, potentially creating pressure along that open column, or allowing for a re-evaluation of the queen's position. This repositioning of the queen aims to untangle black's pieces and find an active square, preparing to support the queenside advance and potentially challenging white's control of the open c-file if an opportunity arises, while also keeping an eye on defensive needs. A daring repositioning, seeking active play on the queen side and hinting at a potential infiltration via the a-file, forcing black to carefully consider the defense of the c4 pawn and the broader strategic implications of this knight's new outpost. Black's queenside pawn structure is being put under immense pressure by the knight's infiltration, forcing a defensive posture. Securing the bishop on c3 establishes a crucial defensive bastion, a silent sentinel now anchoring white's queenside structure against black's encroaching pawn storm and potential piece infiltration via the queenside. Prioritizing king's safety becomes paramount as black fortifies the monarch against the potential onslaught brewing on the king side, creating a solid defensive shield with this quiet maneuver. Asserting queenside influence with queen to e3 aims to reposition the queen for potential central or kingside action, while simultaneously supporting the knight's advanced post on a5, creating an awkward situation for black's king. Reassessing defensive posture, black prioritizes consolidating the bishop's influence and preparing for potential threats around the d-file, aiming to prevent white's pieces from achieving deeper penetration into their territory. steadily consolidating a central foothold. This repositioning of the bishop aims to reinforce control over the c4 square and prepare for potential pressure along the third rank, while also offering a safer square should black's pawn storm advance further. Exploiting white's slightly misplaced bishop and the precariousness of his king's position, black boldly pushes the f-pawn, aiming to shatter the pawn chain and open lines towards the monarch. This aggressive maneuver creates immediate tactical complications, forcing white to make difficult decisions about how to defend and whether to accept the challenge or seek a more passive response. The tension on the kingside ratchets up significantly with this move. Shifting the rook to the open file, white seeks to challenge black's queenside control and potentially unmask the enemy monarch, creating a dynamic imbalance as the pieces rearrange for a decisive encounter. A courageous decision to challenge white's centralized queen and solidify the central pawn structure, although it leaves the queenside potentially open to further pressure. Initiating a pawn thrust on the kingside, this opens up attacking avenues and seeks to disrupt black's compact structure, potentially creating weaknesses around their monarch. The bishop's retreat to h6, while seemingly defensive, might be a strategic repositioning to eye the weakened kingside diagonals and prepare for a potential pawn storm buildup on the f-file. Opening a vital diagonal for the queen, this repositioning prepares to exploit the light squares around black's king, aiming to create a breakthrough or a decisive attack. Unleashing a pawn storm often leaves the king exposed, and here black seeks to shatter white's central control, opening lines for their pieces to exploit the now vulnerable king. This pawn push, while seemingly aggressive, might be a desperate attempt to create counterplay before white's coordinated pieces tighten their grip. The immediate aftermath will reveal if this gambit of the central pawn pays off by generating sufficient attacking force, or if it merely accelerates white's ability to exploit the resulting open lines and weaknesses in black's position. Unleashing the rook onto an open file, white ignites a tactical storm, aiming to exploit the currently exposed enemy monarch. Intensifying the pressure on the e-file and preparing to double rooks, this move boldly challenges white's central pawn structure and seeks to disrupt any cohesive defense. Pivoting the queen back to e1 offers flexibility, preparing to redeploy it to a more active square or to support a pawn push, while also safeguarding against any immediate tactical threats stemming from the open files. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank not only prepares for potential attacks on white's queenside pawns, but also subtly reinforces the defense of the king by creating an escape route on the 7th if needed. A bold bid to pry open the king's sanctuary, this maneuver aims to destabilize black's central pawn structure by creating threats along the reopened diagonal and potentially forcing concessions. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active diagonal on the queenside. Seizing the open file offers a dynamic counterplay, forcing black to confront the pressure on their queenside defenses while simultaneously aiming to exploit the central pawn weaknesses that have emerged. The bishop retreats, seeking safety from the aggressive rook and queen. Shifting the bishop to c3 aims to bolster the queenside pawns against any immediate black incursions, while simultaneously preparing to redeploy the piece to a more active diagonal should the opportunity arise. Navigating the crowded queenside, black seeks to rearrange their forces and find active squares for the bishops, aiming to dislodge white's strong bishop on c3 and potentially generate counterplay. A daring cavalry charge into enemy territory, this knight boldly seeks to disrupt black's established queenside control and sow chaos amidst their pawn structure, aiming to exploit the exposed king. Exchanging queens now under pressure simplifies the position, but also leads into an endgame where white's active rook on b6 and centralized knights will likely dominate the board. The king's path to safety is now significantly less obstructed, allowing for more fluid piece deployment in the latter stages of this engagement. Suddenly, the immediate endgame transition is forced, with black choosing to exchange the last rooks to simplify the position. Seizing the open file with the rook forces a necessary liquidation and simplifies into an endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the kingside will prove a significant asset. Capturing the rook on b5 relinquishes the crucial open b-file, a significant positional concession that will likely lead to a protracted defense of black's remaining structure. Recapturing the pawn on d5 initiates a shift towards an endgame where piece activity and pawn structure become paramount. White has successfully traded off several attacking pieces, simplifying the position to their advantage. The rook on d5 now exerts pressure on black's queenside pawn majority, potentially forcing weaknesses or further concessions. This is a crucial moment for black to consolidate their forces and prevent white from exploiting the open files and open lines their rooks now command. The black king, previously shielded, is now venturing into a potentially precarious central position, a bold decision given the active enemy rooks and bishop that have recently been liberated from their passive guarding duties. The bishop on c3 immediately solidifies control over the central squares, preparing to support a pawn push or redeploy to a more active diagonal. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's established pawn structure and create counterplay on the queenside. Securing the open file immediately forces a reaction from black's displaced pieces. The rook's final journey across the board concludes, exchanging itself for the opponent's knight, a pivotal moment that fundamentally alters the material balance and paves the way for a dramatically simplified endgame where the king's newfound open lines will become a significant concern. Claiming the open b-file with the pawn now solidifies white's territorial advantage and prepares for eventual pawn breakthroughs or maneuvering of pieces to more active squares. The pawn chain on the king side, though broken, still presents a minor impediment to the black rooks finding easy pathways, while the white rook on the file now faces no opposition, and the passed pawn on the queen side has a clear path to promotion. Activating the king is paramount as the queens depart the board. Unleashing the king from its protective shell now is a bold, aggressive gambit to seize the initiative, seeking to exploit the currently loose coordination of white's pieces and perhaps catch them off guard in this critical juncture. The king ventures out, seeking activity in this simplified structure. The pawn's lonely advance, though seemingly aggressive, surrenders a vital outpost on the king side and potentially creates weaknesses for the black king's defense. Creating a pawn chain on the king side offers a defensive barrier and potential attacking avenues, though it temporarily ties down the g-pawn. Carving out a pawn majority on the king side becomes the immediate priority for black now, aiming to create a passed pawn. Opening up the bishop to eye the pawn chain from a new angle, threatening to disrupt black's solid structure on the queen side. Harnessing the queenside pawn majority now becomes paramount. The bishop tucks in, preparing to support a potential advance or to simply maintain a flexible defensive posture as the endgame tightens. Unlocking the bishop's potential on the c-file offers white a vital avenue for counterplay, aiming to disrupt black's increasingly solid pawn structure and potentially creating weaknesses around the monarch. The bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, aiming to support the pawn push and potentially create new attacking avenues on the king side. The bishop on d6 solidifies control over the dark squares and prepares to swing over to the king side, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and potentially support a pawn push. Seeking a more active square, the black king ventures into the center, aiming to participate in the endgame's unfolding drama and perhaps support the central pawn structure. The bishop steps aside, opening a diagonal and preparing to contest the h-file while maintaining pressure on black's advanced pawns and potentially setting up a sacrifice on g4. The king embarks on a daring central quest, aiming to exploit the open lines and participate actively in the endgame's unfolding drama. Pondering the pawn's advance, it boldly ventures, potentially creating a passed threat or demanding immediate attention. Targeting the exposed white king with the bishop now begins a strategic realignment, aiming to exploit the open diagonals and potentially create passed pawns in the ensuing endgame. A fortress is being built on the queen side, aiming to restrict the enemy king's mobility and create a safe haven for the remaining pawns. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active diagonal while maintaining eye contact with the pawn chain's weak point on f3, a subtle threat that might force a concession later. Bolstering the central control, the bishop now occupies a more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses around the king as the game simplifies. The bishop's repositioning to c8 aims to support a potential advance of the h-pawn, which is currently the only pawn capable of reaching the 7th rank, and to prepare for future maneuvers involving the other pieces in this endgame scenario. Repositioning the bishop to b2 aims to bolster the queenside pawns and potentially prepare for a queenside pawn advance, while also keeping an eye on any infiltrations along the 2nd rank. The bishop retreats, maintaining its defensive post on a light square, anticipating potential pawn advances on the kingside or a regrouping maneuver to support the rook. Clearing a path for the bishop to eye that advanced kingside pawn is a key idea, aiming to neutralize the immediate threat and set up potential counterplay. The bishop relinquishes its hold on the b4 square, a subtle shift that opens a new avenue for its long-range influence by pivoting to the a3 diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure or potentially assist in a future kingside advance, while simultaneously preparing for a potential king hunt if white's monarch becomes exposed.